"I'm measuring your pulse," our hero shouted so that the child would not distract him, but he only became more lost from this. He carefully held his hand, trying to measure the number of heartbeats per minute. The boy became infected with syphilis while he was still an embryo. Our hero reasoned. There is no way to cure a congenital disease using cheap methods. He thought sadly to himself. Every time he realized that he could not cure the disease simply because of the lack of development of this world, he was overtaken by sadness. Syphilis that arose when he was older, he could live and at the same time fight the disease. Half of his face is covered with scars, one eye no longer sees, one ear hears poorly. He thought to himself while his soul was being torn apart. Why is this world so unfair? "Have you tried to study martial arts?" asked the rank of the child. "No," came the short answer. "Really? But your tangent has inner strength flowing through it." Our hero spoke in surprise. "Inner strength?" the child asked in surprise. It turns out that thanks to penicillin, not only did his well-being improve, but the energy in his body began to move. Our hero thought to himself and was very surprised. "Are you breathing in some strange way?" he also asked his patient. "Oh, that's right. During my illness, when my temperature was rising, to reduce the pain, I breathed with my stomach like this," the kid explained, showing an example of how he breathed. Did he accumulate inner strength in this way, even without learning the method of energy management? Our hero was interested in his subordinate while the kid continued to illustrate his belly-breathing technique. "If this is true, then the child is a real genius," our hero thought to himself, placing his hand on the child's shoulder. He concentrated on his feelings, trying to analyze the condition and other parameters of the baby. And then he suddenly opened his eyes in surprise. Something hit him very hard. Does he have heavenly circles inside? This is what you would expect to see in a master who took a miracle pill, but not in a child. He doesn't even know about his strength, he thought to himself. The small heavenly circle is a narrow energy circle inside the body. The large heavenly circle is a wide energy circle inside the body. The heavenly circle is one of the trainings that those who comprehend the martial arts of war undergo. It takes a lot of time to master it successfully. "You said you don't have a name, right?" asked our hero. "Yes, the uncles from the How clan call me Hey," answered the naive child. "And also over there. The children call me Dog or Waste." He continued to list his nicknames while our hero scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. "Let's do this. Since I can't write you down in this way, we'll choose your real name," stated our hero, presenting the pen to paper. Yuhu, who was standing next to him, was very surprised by such a statement and became a little worried. "Heh, name." The child laughed joyfully, after all. Before that, he didn't have a name. "May heaven give you a child for all the misfortunes that he has experienced. Let's take the first two hieroglyphs from the expression God's mercy and get," our hero reasoned while writing down a new name for the baby. "Qian Wu," he wrote on a piece of paper. "Now you're Qian Wu. Chan is in the word God, mercy. Your name means a person who is helped by heaven." Our hero explained to the shining part and showing how to spell the child's name correctly. "Wow, I like it," the child shouted joyfully, shaking his fists. "By the way, would you like to live in some other place than the How clan?" our hero asked. Beautiful and pleasant daylight filled the room, creating a special atmosphere. Light, snow-white fabrics hung above, and a blue staircase below attracted the eye. In the center of the room, a large blue table, covered with various objects, attracted attention. At this table there was a young guy named Lin Jaegel, with snow-white long hair, dressed in blue and white clothes. Standing next to him was a guy with red hair named Yuho, holding his hands behind his back. He told the new guy that, according to people, the reason for their visit was concern for the condition of the patient Wang Ka-gyong. But the girl was already at the stage of full recovery. The doctor had nothing to check. The long-haired blonde sighed and thought that those people were looking for a reason to find fault with at least something. Juho, looking into the guy's eyes, told him that if they refuse those people, then by doing so they will give them a reason. That's why he approved the visit to him. Lin Jaegel was currently with the doctors who were measuring her pulse. Dressed in a snow-white robe, she sat on a white sheet. Her brown hair was folded into a neat bun. In front of her stood 5 healers in long suits of white-brown and white-violet shades, topped off with white hats on their heads. The doctors knew that Juho approved the visit to Lin Jaegel. The long-haired blonde said that he felt sorry for their doctors because they would have a hard time. Yuho reported that the doctors of the Huaju infirmary would seize any opportunity to reproach them, and their doctors would have to resolve the situation with all their might. Lowering his head, the red-haired guy told the fair-haired owner that he did not need to get involved in this commotion. Juho added that, in fact, colleagues from another infirmary simply visited them. While the red-haired guy was expounding, the owner looked at him with his sky-blue eyes and listened carefully to his words. Lin Jagal, having listened to the guy's words, put his hand on the table, thereby helping himself a little to get up from the table, answered the guy's words by telling him that he was right. But most of all, he was worried about this trifle. After a short pause in his words, the blonde, placing his hands on top of one another, said that he was worried about the person he had met. Hao agreed with the owner, because he himself did not expect that lady would personally pay a visit. The long-haired owner suggested that he was interested in hearing about the art of surgery. Closing his eyes, the red-haired guy asked if they would continue to play along. The owner, looking at the guy, told him that someday he would have to stop her. But as long as his motives are unclear, they should not interfere. On this wonderful day, the sun playfully illuminated every corner of the hospital grounds. Each hospital building was beautiful. They elegantly combined wooden elements with stone structures, creating a unique architectural appearance. Outside the hospital complex were beautiful, tall mountains that added to the majesty of the landscape. Doctors moved around the area, moving from one duty to another. Despite their busy lives, the surrounding natural beauty and architectural polish of the place added a special charm to the place. But unfortunately, at that moment, the doctors began to quarrel among themselves. One doctor shouted to others that he did not understand how to explain the fact that they dared to use unconfirmed medical methods to treat a patient. In the room, near the little patient, stood doctors in brown and blue clothes. It was not their conflict that was heating up. Doctors in brown clothes shouted at the doctors opposite, saying that if they transferred the girl to the Huaju infirmary, she would be cured there in 20 days. The purple-robed doctors, opening their mouths at the words of those other doctors, looked at them indignantly. Doctors in purple robes accused other doctors with a loud cry of having first abandoned the girl to the mercy of fate, and now they had come to knock themselves out, saying that proven treatment methods would be enough. The doctors were very outraged. To the brown-robed healers, the position of the girl's father, who turned to those other healers, was clear. Apparently their answer did not suit him, and they could not earn due trust in themselves. The doctors in brown clothes were very outraged that the patient's life was being played with, and they were conducting their experiments on her. They could not understand how this could be normal for other doctors. The purple doctors told the brown ones not to talk nonsense. After all, the girl was at that moment on the verge of life and death, so it was necessary to do at least something to save her. The girl herself, at that moment as the doctors were quarreling, simply remained silent, looking at them with her brown eyes. She was very unhappy that they were quarreling so much. The purple-robed doctors continued to prove that there was no way to save her, so they tried various experiments to help save her life. Those dressed in brown robes continued to say that the skills of the Huaju infirmary would have been enough to save the child. One of the doctors said that the girl's father had already provided them with their answer, in which it was said that they would not accept the patient. Doctors in brown uniforms furiously argued to other doctors that they said they would not accept them, but they did not refuse treatment. They said that they did this because their head, after the examination, began to think about a treatment plan. The doctors in brown uniforms did not believe them. They believed that they were lying and not blushing. A girl patient named Wang Kagyeon sat in her own thoughts. She saw that the Huaju doctors were angry. She assumed that the incident caused a significant commotion among the Murim clans. The brown-robed doctors demanded that those other doctors call their head. Doctors in purple robes informed those that their head would not personally settle minor disputes. They said that would they really be simple doctors from another hospital asking Baekrin Uisung himself to come. Then the doctors in brown clothes demanded to bring the owner's student. Hearing this, the doctors in purple clothes twisted their faces with anger. The purple doctors considered the doctors from the other infirmary to be insolent. The brown doctors told those that if he had nothing to hide, then there was no reason to refuse to meet with them. The doctors were arguing among themselves when suddenly a very loud roar attracted their attention. They all turned around to see what was happening. There were very loud noises behind the big orange door. The doctors were perplexed. Even when they turned around, they did not understand what was happening. A man in a brown suit flew into the room at a speed like a ninja. The man suddenly, with some unexpected jerk, rushed towards the group in the brown robe of doctors. They instantly felt the tension and fear of the growing aggression in his movements. The doctors, sensing danger, rushed to the sides, trying to get away from him as quickly as possible, because his behavior seemed to them extremely threatening and unbridled. But the man still touched one doctor in a brown uniform and killed him. That doctor was lying on the floor with his mouth open and his own large pool of blood spilling around him. His colleague looked at him and was very scared and upset. He considered that doctor his protector. The man suddenly moved his foot to the side with strong speed. The man, full of indignation and rage, aimed his red, anger-filled eyes at a group of doctors covered in brown medical gowns, saying that they only pray with their tongues perfectly. He insisted that they were just scoundrels from Huaju, incapable of action. The patient was shocked when she saw the man, and her face expressed this feeling. She realized that her father was standing in front of her, entering the room. The girl's father again decided to go towards the brown doctors. They screamed very loudly in fear because they were very afraid of his aggression, which could harm their lives. The patient's father loudly accused the doctors, claiming that they did not understand what his daughter went through because of monsters like them. The doctors in brown robes began to stutter with fear. One of them, holding out his hand as if in defense, asked the man to calm down because doesn't he know that it is forbidden to kill in the infirmary? The man was outraged that the doctors asked him to calm down. He tensed his fist with all his might in anger. He argued that if it weren't for their benefactor, they were idiots and would have met him in the next world. He told them thank you, that they themselves came to him and poured out their own grave, as in such a situation they couldn't help him bury it now. The doctors were filled with even greater fear after the words of the girl's father. The patient's father looked at the group of doctors with insane anger, as if devouring them with his gaze. Someone outside the room asked them to stop all this. A guy ran into the room as fast as he could, dressed in a green and white robe, with long black hair tied in a ponytail. He was a benefactor. The man turned around to look at him. The benefactor guy, clenching her teeth, cast her gaze at the group of doctors and the girl's father. With their mouths open, the doctors looked at her all together. The guy who just entered the room said that they were in the infirmary, and such behavior was unacceptable there. The man calmed down a little. The benefactor continued to look at them. The guy told them to arrange a showdown in another place because the infirmary should be calm. This is not a place for a showdown. Everyone in the room was silent. The man simply stood silently, assessing the situation. The doctors were very happy that the benefactor had come. Now they were not in mortal danger from the girl's father. The benefactor guy smiled, turning to the girl's father and told her that he had heard that he wanted to see him. The doctors in brown clothes were shocked. They didn't expect this guy to be a student. They believed that the student was much more mature, but they were like a child. The doctors in brown robes wanted to know more about their mentor. The benefactor said that he could not provide them with even more information about the secret manuscripts he received from his mentor. His name is unknown in these parts because he comes from a distant continent. The doctors stood in bewilderment. They did not understand the point of hiding his identity. They asked him to tell them everything. The guy really didn't like their questions. He started to get angry and closed his eyes to console his anger and try to calm down in a couple of seconds. The benefactor decided to get rid of them, telling them that the name of his mentor was Hippocrates. The doctors became embarrassed and exchanged frightened glances. Their surprise was so great that their jaws dropped and their pupils danced restlessly around the room. The name uttered by the guy seemed something strange and mysterious to them, causing a feeling of misunderstanding among them. Having collected their thoughts, the doctors told the guy that they had heard that he had lost his memory. The guy became very angry because of their words. His face took on an angry look. Gritting his teeth, he told them that this really happened, and most of his memories were erased, but he remembers his school mentor well. The doctors looked at their benefactor in surprise. They were not sure of the veracity of his words. The girl's father was filled with strong aggression. He started shouting loudly at them. He was very indignant that they dared to suspect the benefactor of lying to his mentors in school. The benefactor himself felt embarrassed by the man's reaction. A doctor in a purple robe quickly ran into the room. Everyone in the room turned and looked at this doctor. The doctor came running to tell the news. The doctor reported that Mr. Pek Rin Song ordered the benefactor to immediately put his official suit in order and go to him. The guy was very surprised. He didn't understand why it was needed. They never prettify themselves for a new patient, because their task is to cure the patient and nothing more. The doctor who just ran into the room also said that V. Wang Ya will be here soon. Doctors in brown robes stood with serious faces and looked at the doctor. The man, sweating, also stood and remained silent with his mouth slightly open. The benefactor guy stood with his mouth slightly open in his thoughts, having heard only the information received. After rummaging through his own memories, the guy remembered that Wang Ya is the name given to the descendants of the emperor who do not have the right to inherit the throne. The patient's father asked the doctor whether Wang Ya would definitely come and whether he had made a mistake. The doctor said that he was not confusing anything. In fact, the main heiress was coming to visit them. The brown-robed doctors were very indignant that such a person was coming to that hospital. They believed that this could not happen, because Her Highness was a long-time guest of the Huaju Infirmary. It seemed to them that they had confused her with another Wang Ya. The purple-robed healer shouted at them that they were making a mistake. She would not have the courage to risk her job for the sake of a lie. She was sure that this was definitely the main heiress. The doctors in brown clothes continued to get angry. It was unpleasant for them that the main thing was that the heiress would not come to them in the infirmary, but to other doctors. They didn't understand how this could even happen. The benefactor stood rummaging through his own thoughts, only thinking about the news that had been said about Wang Ya's death. The guy smiled. He was flattered that a VIP client would come to them. In this world, all members of the imperial family are descendants of the legendary first emperor Fuxi. In the middle there was a circle that resembled the sun, around which dots flickered, indicating the sun. Around him stood many people covered in red robes. There were many red lines around them, like fiery lines. Fuxi was an ancient deity from the time of the creation of this world. He, being one of the three rulers, conveyed to man the knowledge of fire, 8 trigrams and animal husbandry. The emperor himself was also dressed in a red robe and had short black hair. There was an earring in his ear, and on his head was a hat with 2 red ribbons. Also on his belt was a golden belt with a circle in the middle. In the human world, Fuxi gave birth to a child, and he in turn continued the family line. It was his descendants who became members of the imperial family. They all have a common surname, Fun, and being the descendants of the creator of the world, they are endowed with exceptional abilities. The hierarchy of the imperial family is established according to 2 criteria. The first is how strong their maternal relatives are. The second is how much Fuxi blood they inherited. The chief heiress has the most outstanding talent, but she refused the title of empress. She had dark long hair and amber eyes. She was wearing a long red and gold long vest. She also wore an orange and blue colored robe tied with a blue and gold sash. Under this robe there was a white shirt, and she also had white pants. She had blue-gold shoes on her feet. The heiress was granted 2 abilities. She had the ability to control and manipulate the heat of objects she touched. Cases when a descendant of the imperial family wields 2 abilities at once are very rare. Despite the fact that the main heiress did not have strong relatives on her mother's side, she, the 8th princess, crushed the army ranks of the princes and took the lead. It can be called a killing machine. It is also a genius that protects the imperial throne. Remembering what kind of person she was, the benefactor was very interested in why she came to them. He folded his hands to his chest and stood thoughtfully with his head down. They say that the main heiress has been a regular patient of the Huaju Infirmary for a long time. Apparently, the news about the incident with the archer spread powerfully among the people. The news spread so much that even members of the imperial family became interested. The guy finished preparing for the arrival of the expected guests. The purple-robed doctor said that you need to go quickly to the entrance, since Mr. Ui Seong is already waiting there. The guy and the doctor ran quickly towards the entrance. At the entrance to the infirmary, there was a huge number of doctors who surrounded the owner, waiting for the guest. The guy quickly came running and wondered what was going on here. Having looked at everything that was happening and assessed it, he thought that the situation at the moment could not be stranger. His attention was drawn to the fact that all the infirmary workers were trembling with excitement. Lin Yeagal asked the guy to hurry up and come to him quickly. In this entire crowd also stood the red-haired Hao. The benefactor stood nervously awaiting the arrival of the guest. All the people standing at the entrance noticed that someone was driving in the distance. In front of them was a beautiful landscape of high greenish mountains. The red carriage was getting closer and closer to the infirmary. The guest will be there soon. The crowd shouted that Mrs. Wang Ya was coming. Everyone in the infirmary couldn't wait to see her. The guy looked into the distance with his eyes wide open. He couldn't wait to see the guest. A large number of people in red uniforms were carrying a red palanquin with a gray-yellow roof. in which Wang Ya was located. They were getting closer and closer to the infirmary. Ahead of them all was a man with a long black tail. On the top of the pelican were 2 red flags with Chinese initials. The pelican itself was carried by men with long collected hair and red aprons on their necks. The pelican was made in red and gold tones. It depicted 2 golden snakes on both sides. A large group of warriors had already begun to enter the infirmary. Looking at these warriors, the benefactor was very surprised. He was shocked at what a huge pelican they were carrying. The warriors walked with a serious face. Their faces showed all the power they possessed. Each of them emanated incredible energy, overflowing with strength and courage. Hao shouted, "Wang Ya!" The infirmary owner bowed slightly, thereby greeting Majesty Wang Ya. The healers also followed the example of the owner. They also began to worship and greet Her Majesty. All the workers standing at the entrance lay on the floor worshiping the palpkin in which the heiress was located. From the red screen of the pelican, Wang Ya extended her hand, telling them that enough was enough. The girl said that she did not have time for pleasantries. She stood calmly, looking at the workers with her amber eyes. She seemed somehow menacing at that moment. The benefactor did not expect such a reaction from the heiress. He opened his mouth in surprise. There was silence. The warriors bowed to greet the infirmary workers. The main heiress also stood silently. She looked at the infirmary with her eyes, taking in everything ahead. The soldiers began to carry out a man who was bandaged. They began to carry him on a stretcher towards the infirmary, with the heiress herself walking ahead of them. They were approaching the workers lying on the floor, carrying their patient on a stretcher. The patient himself was in bandages. He was wearing long white clothes. A benefactor guy named Chanhe Jin had been bowing all this time with his eyes downcast. He looked up and saw that the wars were carrying someone on a stretcher. He was interested in what it could mean and who was there anyway. After looking a little closer, he realized that they were carrying some kind of patient. He lowered his gaze again. The wars approached the workers. They asked which of them was the main one in the infirmary. They wanted to ask him to come forward. The head of the infirmary was a long-haired blonde named Lin Jagal. The owner of the infirmary stood up and walked towards the guests who had just arrived. They showed how he approached them with a glance at the newly arrived patient. There was a guy lying on a stretcher. He was writhing very much in pain. He had long black hair tied with red ribbons on his head. It was obvious to the naked eye that he had some problems with his leg, since his leg was covered in bandages, through which a little blood was shed. Lin Yeagle looked at the guy, assessing the situation. Looking at the guy, he assumed that in front of him was a young man who looked to be a little over 30 years old. The owner of the infirmary looked at his leg. He assumed that, judging by the condition, he had a broken leg after falling from a horse. It was clear that the fracture was of an open type. The heiress turned to the head of Chagall. She asked him to hurry up with treatment. The action takes place in a therapy room. 4 warriors stood near its doors. The heiress stood in the therapy room with the owner of the infirmary. Opposite them lay a patient. The heiress looked at the lying guy. She was very worried about his condition. While they stood near the guy, he himself was writhing in pain. The fracture to his leg caused very severe discomfort and pain. Van Eyck was very worried about the guy's condition. She asked the owner of the infirmary what he thought about everything that was happening. Lin Jagal looked at the newly arrived patient, collecting his thoughts. Assess the guy's whole situation. The owner said that it would be very difficult to restore him. Restoration, nicknamed hand restorer in the Murim world, refers to putting bones together, like pieces of a puzzle by hand. The heiress, having heard that it would be difficult to restore the guy, became very angry. If it is difficult to restore, then what can they offer then? Cheonyi Jin remembered that this episode happened in the novel. He reminded himself in his thoughts that when treating a fracture, as in the case of other external injuries, it is important not to waste time. The benefactor asked the heiress how much time had passed since her friend's injury. The warrior heard the question and decided to answer it himself instead of the heiress. He turned to the guy and said that the gentleman fell from his horse about an hour ago. This warrior was surprised that some little boy was asking about the patient's injuries. He wondered what his role was in this infirmary. The owner of the infirmary introduced Choni Dean as his student. They looked at the guy with great surprise because he was very young to be a student. The heiress looked at the guy, assessing him with her eyes. She also could not understand how such a young guy could become a student, while the newly arrived guests were thinking about what kind of young student was standing in front of them. This student himself was thinking about the patient. He thought that if an hour had passed, then the fall had happened somewhere nearby. Most likely it was somewhere in the area of their infirmary. He was amazed that the events of the novel had changed a lot. The guy thought that since only an hour had passed, maybe things weren't so bad, and they wouldn't be able to give me proper help. The doctors in brown robes decided to add their 2 cents. In their thinking, it was somehow useless to treat the patient. The leg had to be amputated. The girl was very angry at the words of the doctors. She was outraged that they were offering to amputate her leg instead of trying to somehow cure and help. Red-haired Yuho also became very angry because of the words of the brown doctors. He contorted his face, showing all his bad attitude towards them. He really didn't like the fact that they behaved like clingy people, forgetting that they were guests and they were nobody here. Yuho turned to the doctors in brown clothes, informing them that this was the therapy room of the Pekrin Infirmary. So he urgently asked the doctors of the Huaju Infirmary to leave. The doctors of the Huaju Infirmary angrily recalled that Wang Ya had been a patient of their infirmary for a long time. Also, the doctors in brown robes said that they followed them all only out of a desire to help the patient. But in fact, their motives were different. Choni Jin at that moment looked at them with his kama gaze, which reflected all the distrust towards those doctors. But the heiress herself turned her gaze to the doctors from another infirmary, thinking for a couple of seconds over their just-spoken words. After standing and thinking for a while, she asked if the doctors of Huaju really thought that the leg should be cut off and not try to cure it somehow. The doctors in brown clothes once again confirmed their words. They tried to prove to Wang Ya that if bone fragments remained inside, then manual restoration was possible, but it would be very dangerous for the patient himself. And based on these thoughts, the doctor assured that in order to save the patient's life, the limb would have to be amputated. He tried very hard to somehow win over the heiress, because she was a very great person, and losing such a regular visitor was very bad for their infirmary. There was a lot of tension in the room. The owner of the infirmary and the heiress stood pondering the words that the doctors from another infirmary had just told them. Lin Jagal looked at the doctors as if devouring them with his gaze. It was very unpleasant for him that right next to him, in his own infirmary, they were trying to lure the patient to themselves. He thought it was very rude of them. Chonijin also stood pondering the words of the doctors. His face showed sadness mixed with aggression. The corners of his lips were lowered down, and his gaze was directed at Wang Ya, so to speak, to monitor her reaction to their words. He believed that the situation that was happening now was not very good. He could not believe that the doctors of the Huaju Infirmary allowed themselves to make loud statements in their infirmary. He was sure that they would do anything to lure the main heiress back to their side. But it was the wrong thing to do, in his opinion. While everyone in the room was talking, discussing what they would do with the patient himself extended his hand and called Wang Ya. Wang Ya heard his call and directed her gaze towards him. The heiress turned to him, taking his hand with both hands, which he extended to her. She asked him what he wanted to ask. A patient named Lan Lan told her that he would rather commit suicide than walk with one leg for the rest of his days. He didn't want to be disabled for the rest of his life, so his priority was to heal his leg rather than cut it off. Wang Ya was very scared and angry at the words of her friend. She was very unpleasant that he started talking about suicide. Lying on the bed and coughing loudly, the patient begged not to amputate, but simply to try to save his leg as best as possible. I continued to hold the guy's hand with my hands. He urgently asked that they not take away the only joy in his life. The benefactor was very surprised because there was no such scene in the novel. Thoughtful and confused, he thought that perhaps there had been changes in the plot. It was not clear whether this was a butterfly effect or a conspiracy. In the original, the incident happened near the Huaju Infirmary. And in this story, the main thing is that the heiress rejected the young man's sincere request and agreed to amputate him. However, for Chong Yulan, who had been an artist and brothel member all his life, the inability to dance was tantamount to death. He was severely depressed all day long because he had lost his only joy in life. Even if he was pointed at because of his low status, he could tolerate such treatment since he was cherished by the main heiress. But the absence of a leg shattered everything that was inside him every time he looked at it. Having lost his leg, Chong Yulan refused to eat and drink, which is why he began to weaken. His face was all tired and stretched out from weakness. And most importantly, the heiress lost any sense in conducting state affairs and stopped going out into the world. The events that took place caused a fierce struggle for the position of emperor, and unrest began. Remembering this scenario of the novel, the benefactor suggested that there was probably some kind of conspiracy here. He was thinking about what to do. The owner asked the guy what he thought about this. Lin Jagal asked the guy to examine the patient. He listened to him. Looking at the teacher's gaze, the guy suggested that he, too, believed that the leg should be amputated. The student approached the bed on which the patient was lying. He asked the heiress to allow him to examine the patient. The patient looked at the benefactor with hope in his eyes. He sincerely hoped that something could really be done with his leg, other than amputation. Wang Ya let go of the guy's hand. The student approached the patient to examine his leg. The student closed his eyes to include all his inner strength. With every second, his gaze acquired the properties of an X-ray machine. Carefully examining the patient, his gaze seemed to pierce every corner of his body, seeing through the skin and flesh. His attention was focused on the damaged bone, and he began to examine it in detail, trying to understand what actions could be taken to restore and treat it. While this was happening, the heiress looked at the student with alarm, hoping that he would be able to help without the extreme necessity of cutting off his leg. The student continued to examine his leg with his eyes closed, pondering his further actions. He opened his eyes and was ready to give his answer about the treatment. Having collected his thoughts, the benefactor informed everyone that the leg could be restored, and it was not necessary to cut it off. The heiress was very surprised because other doctors had just strongly suggested to her that it would be impossible to do without amputation. And then this student says that there is a possibility of a cure. Wang Ya couldn't understand how this guy could figure out whether he could cure his leg. The brown-robed healer was very frightened by the guy's words. It was very unprofitable for them that their words were untrue. They decided to continue to convince the heiress. They convinced her that she should not fall for the insidious machinations of the Baek-rin infirmary, who just wanted to grab another achievement. Juho, hearing their words, was very indignant. He was filled with anger. He didn't like the fact that the Telekari believed that they were carrying out insidious intrigues. The brown healers shouted at Juho. They said that they didn't know what else to call them. They were more confident that a person who would survive only after amputation could do without it. Wang Ya silently looked at the young student. With hope in her eyes, she asked if it would really be possible to cure her leg. The student replied that the patient was very lucky. The blood arteries were not seriously damaged. The student said that the teacher probably thinks exactly the same as he does. He assured that they were able to restore the limb using the medical techniques of their infirmary. However, they cannot yet give her an exact answer. Wang Ya stood in thought, but only with the words spoken by the student. The doctors in brown robes tried to draw the attention of the heiress to the fact that they were unsure of their abilities. They assured that they planned the intrigue, taking advantage of their student. The student himself was filled with aggression due to the fact that other doctors believed that they had planned an intrigue. It was clear from his face that he was about to attack the doctors. The owner of the infirmary put his hand on the young guy's shoulder, trying to calm him down. Lin Jaegel calmly asked that this be left to him. In response to the words of the doctors, the owner of the infirmary said that he was sure that there was not a single infirmary that would dare to carry out fraud with the main heiress. He asked Wang Ya to make the decision on how the patient's fate would turn out. Lin Jaegel told her that he lost his leg. Patients can be saved 100%, but there is one problem. If a leg is cut off, the patient will no longer be able to walk. He himself does not want this, so he will have to go on an adventure to save his life. If they succeeded, albeit with minor difficulties, then the patient would be able to dance again. The girl faced a very difficult choice. She could allow her leg to be cut off, but thereby drive her friend into deep depression. But she could also allow treatment to begin. But there was a possibility that the treatment might not help, and the patient would die on its own. The events take place in a 2-story brown and blue infirmary. On this day, the weather was not very clear, and a gray fog was wandering along the street. In the end, Wang Ya accepted the Buma's sincere plea. Despite all kinds of criticism from the members of the Huaju infirmary, the student did not hesitate to take on the treatment of the patient. Of course, this criticism was unpleasant to him, but he trusted his inner strengths. The owner trusted his student, so he supported his words that there was a possibility of a cure. Juho was glad that the heiress decided to stay in their infirmary with her brought patient. But he also continued to be angry with the doctors from the other infirmary. As preparations began for emergency surgery, the Peck infirmary became lively again. In the middle of the room, there was a small table near the benefactor, filled with a variety of surgical instruments and various containers intended for use during the surgical operation. First, the student decided to undergo anesthesia. He placed internal energy on the tip of the needles and began to pierce energy points one by one. The gate of energy, the sea of blood, and then the ridge of the mountain. Even in modern times, there are cases when a wound is anesthetized using acupuncture. However, a fracture, and an open one at that, cannot be anesthetized using this method. Having examined the wounds more carefully, the student was convinced that the blood vessels were not severely damaged. The peroneal artery was fine, which means the nerve endings are also fine. Smiling, the young student thought that the guy was very lucky. The guy himself looked at the benefactor with a smile. I assure him that thanks to him, he was able to avoid amputation. He was very happy about this, so he thanked his benefactor greatly. With respect, you, the patient began to praise the student. The student asked the Buma to address him as you. It's just that when people addressed him as you, he felt very awkward. Buma said that nevertheless, he was born from a concubine, so this benefactor needs to address him on a first-name basis. The young student agreed with the patient, but he could not understand what the heiress found most important in him. Wang Ya cannot help but know that marrying an influential person as part of a political move will be a much more profitable decision for her. The student looked at the guy, and in his thoughts decided that he was, after all, truly gifted with a beautiful appearance. As a benefactor, he considered his teacher much more handsome, and that guy was not his equal, period, but he seems to have a good character. The patient asked Cheoni-jin whether he would be able to continue his activities as an artist. Sweating a little, the student answered with a kind smile that yes, he could, but for this they would have to try. The benefactor could not understand what dancing could mean for Buma. After all, his real appearance is not very different from the one described in the book. He stood there in thought, turning over all his thoughts. The student could not understand why the memories of the novel he read went against his medical intuition, but for him, it was very strange. The young guy took his box in his hands, continuing to delve into his thoughts. The student noticed that the patient had a charming smile that looked like red roses. He turned around and began to walk towards the exit. Turning around a little, the benefactor thought why this guy, who just recently told him to urgently treat his leg, was behaving strangely. He behaved strangely in that now he smiles friendly so that he doesn't ask. The young guy found him suspicious. The student changed into a surgical uniform and decided to start by cleaning the wound. In all his time in this world, the benefactor performed an operation only for the second time in his life. The guy began to carefully wash the wound, preparing it for surgery. For now, this young surgeon had more suitable instruments in his hands. The student took his small surgical knife, preparing to begin the operation. In his thoughts, the guy thought that if the place where the blood does not come into contact with the fascia and subcutaneous fat turns out to be a breeding ground for microbes, then he will have to remove them as carefully as possible. The guy decided to move on to sanitation, that is, to eliminate infected or dead soft tissue from the body. With careful movements of his hand, the young surgeon began the operation with his surgical knife. His colleague was standing next to him, helping him operate on the patient. Out of excitement, the student began to face a little under. He tried to be very careful so as not to make any mistakes, and thereby not let down the main heiress. Juho gently moved his hand with a white napkin under the young surgeon's face. The young guy was very surprised by this gesture from his colleague. He was very surprised that Juho wiped the sweat from his face. Sweating even more from awkwardness, the student noticed that his colleague was very insightful. He didn't even ask to do this. The doctors managed to cut the leg, which meant that the first stage was over. The young surgeon asked his teacher for help. The teacher decided to perform emergency external fixation. She meant a way to temporarily fix a limb using half pins. The young guy showed the owner of the infirmary where he needed emergency external fixation. Metal pins pierced the patient's leg like tofu sticks. Other doctors watched the operation and wrote something in their notes. The benefactor thought that he was worrying in vain because things were going smoothly. Now he needs to maintain temporary fixation for a while and monitor the condition of the soft tissues, and only then begin the second operation. And then suddenly something attracted the attention of the owner of the infirmary. He told the student that the fighter was moving his fingers. The young guy responded calmly to this, saying that this sometimes happens during anesthesia. Cheoni-jin's face changed dramatically, his eyes wide and sweating profusely. Juho fearfully reported that the patient's pulse was increasing, but the patient himself still did not wake up, although he opened his eyes. The young surgeon stood in fear from just hearing the information that his fingers were moving and his pulse was quickening. He was very frightened by the fact that he did not understand what was happening now. The doctors looked at the patient anxiously, trying to understand what was happening to him. The patient began to twitch and open his mouth. His hands began to move actively. Juho said in a very frightened voice that the patient began to have convulsions. The teacher and student stood in a stupor, unable to utter a single word. The patient began to actively move and twitch. He moved his legs, arms, head, and mouth. The patient's convulsions began to become even more frequent. Juho began to worry very much because he could not understand why this began to happen to him. Juho grabbed the patient's hand. He squeezed his hand as if trying to calm it from shaking. The student stood in bewilderment. He did not expect such consequences to overtake them and did not know what to do now. The young surgeon's attention turned to something strange. He opened his eyes wide in surprise. Some strange shadows began to emanate from Yuha throughout the room. The confusion looked like some kind of tree branches. They did not spread throughout the patient's body. The benefactor was very surprised by this development of events. Juho loomed over the patient, his shadow moving. The doctors, who were standing and taking notes, were distracted from their notes. They watched everything that was happening in shock. The student tried to understand what kind of technique it was. In his opinion, it is unlikely that it belonged to Chongpa. The red-haired doctor directed his gaze at the young surgeon, calling him master. The young surgeon was very surprised by this address to him. He didn't expect to be called master. The benefactor approached his colleague and began to look at his hands. He began to delve into his own thoughts, wondering what all this could mean. Perhaps these were complications, but with acute long-term compression syndrome, this should not happen. Or perhaps he suggested acute pulmonary embolism began due to blockage of fat. But most likely this is not the case because such a reaction should not have followed. Or perhaps there were problems with the heart in general. He could not understand anything. The patient's limbs were shaking like a person with epilepsy. But it was not clear why he was unconscious. The young guy was thinking about all this, expressing very strong anxiety on his face. His teacher put a hand on his shoulder, asking him to remain calm. The teacher told the student that it was like the disease from Murim, and the student may not know, because his knowledge is not from here. The owner of the infirmary said that he himself would now examine the patient. Lin Yeagle placed his hand on the patient's chest. Golden lines began to run around him. The teacher closed his eyes to concentrate on his inner strength. Yuho at that moment also had his eyes closed. Chan Hee-jin was surprised by the unexpected actions of the owner of the infirmary. His teacher abruptly took a huge needle. It was not clear what he wanted to do now, but it was clear that he was going to pierce her with something. The teacher's gaze froze at one point. He sharply pierced the patient's body with his long and large needle. A large amount of blood splashed around. All the doctors stood in shock at what was happening. Juho continued to stand with his eyes closed. The young surgeon shouted, "Teacher!" Then it became clear that the teacher stuck his game in the patient's stomach. Such actions caused the unconscious patient to scream. The owner informed his student that he needed to cut the stomach immediately. He must be cut immediately because otherwise the blood will clog the energy channels, and he will choke in blood. The young surgeon obeyed the comma and began cutting into the abdomen. Having cut open the stomach, they discovered that some strange purple worm was crawling in the intestines. The young guy assumed that it was a parasite. He couldn't believe his eyes, because it was very huge in size. A genus of parasite attached itself to the patient's stomachs. The owner turned to Yuho, and before he could say what he wanted from him, he understood him without words. They took huge needles into their hands, aiming at the giant parasite that was in the stomach. Colleagues began to actively pierce the parasite with their needles. The parasite detached itself from the pinkish intestines with its sharp teeth. With a quick movement of his hand, the teacher reached into the patient's stomach. While he was doing this, the student simply watched everything that was happening in amazement. With a deft and quick movement of his hand, he managed to get the long purple parasite out of the intestines. The doctors looked at this parasite in horror as it showed its sharp triangular teeth. The young surgeon also looked at this monster that had just been pulled out of his stomach. He was filled with horror. The red-haired guy quickly ran for a large gray jar with a red lid. He ran to the owner, opening his jar so that he put this terrifying parasite directly into it. The teacher looked into the urn, holding the long parasite in his hand. Very quickly, he moved this purple monster into a gray jar that his colleague brought. With quick movements of his hands, Juho decided to lock the parasite in the jar. He had to act very quickly because the parasite could very easily escape. With all his strength, the red-haired guy flattened the provocative monster with a red lid. Lin Jaegel and Yuho managed to seal the parasite in a jar. The red-haired doctor began to tighten the lid. The doctors calmed down a little because this terrible monster from the stomach was now under the lid and could not escape anywhere. Juho was pleased with himself because he was able to close the lid in time to prevent the parasite from escaping. He laughed at the parasite. Lin Jaegel also laughed at the parasite and was pleased with himself. He was able to identify the presence of the parasite and remove it from the patient's intestines. The rest of the medical professionals in the room were in complete shock and amazement. Their facial expressions, hidden behind their masks, reflected open mouths and expressions of surprise. Because of the masks, one could see streams of sweat appearing on their faces. So great was their emotional rise from what was happening. The young surgeon looked at the jar in which the nasty parasite was located. On the surface of this jar, his face in a mask was displayed. The patient's abdominal wound was treated and covered with cloth. All the doctors present in the room looked at the calmly lying patient. The patient's convulsions stopped, and now he simply lay quietly with his mouth slightly open. To prevent infection from entering the wound, immediate intervention with sutures was required. This was critical to avoid any risk of infection and ensure rapid repair of damaged tissue. The young surgeon took a medical needle and thread to sew up the patient's wound. While the student stitched up the wound with his own hands, the teacher carefully watched his actions. The teacher told the young guy that the creature they found in the stomach is called a stomach worm. Juho, holding a jar with a worm, reported that the patient had not taken the prescribed medicine for 10 or 20 days, so the parasite was rampant in his body, and for the same reason it is of such a huge size. The young surgeon looked at his teacher and asked if this worm was similar to the bloody worms used by the demonic school. Lin Jagal answered him that this creature does not reach the level of the demonic school. This parasite is from Safa. Moreover, it is used in some parts of Haomun when assigning spies. Cheonhee Jin looked in surprise at the patient lying unconscious with his mouth slightly open. He was surprised that perhaps this patient was a spy from Haomun. A magnificent sunset lay over the infirmary, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Clouds slowly floated across the skies, decorating this picturesque landscape with their graceful shapes and play of colors. The young surgeon put all his surgical instruments back in place. The guy sighed with relief, scratching his nose with his hand on top of his mask. He was very glad that they had finally completed the task, and they had succeeded. The benefactor told the owner of the infirmary that he needed to tell Wang Ya about what happened, without hiding anything. The blonde chief surgeon stood for a short pause, thinking about everything that had just happened. He agreed with the burglar, because if they hide the truth, they will commit a terrible sin. It is better not to get involved in the affairs of the imperial family. Also, the teacher, looking at the unconscious patient, added that he does not know how everything would have turned out if they were not in the know, but since the truth is revealed, he is not sure what will happen to them. Cheonhee Jin announced that after recovery he will need to undergo a second operation, but his teacher felt that this might not be so necessary. The young surgeon said that the need for this is strong, since confirmed tissues need time to regenerate. And if they leave everything as it is, there is a high probability of complications. Another issue was that since the patient practiced martial arts, the speed of soft tissue recovery cannot be accurately predicted. If regeneration proceeds quickly, then after removing the temporary supporting rods, doctors will be able to save not only the patient's life, but also his limb by performing the main operation. Juho stood and listened to what the young surgeon was saying with his eyes closed. The owner of the infirmary was not sure that Wang Ya would agree to the second operation. It was a bit dark outside at that time, fog shrouded many areas, and a small amount of light was visible through it. At the entrance to the heiress, right next to the door, stood two warriors, vigilantly guarding her. Their impressive figure and wary appearance indicated that they were ready to take on any responsibility for the safety and protection of their mistress. The heiress herself was in a cozy room filled with pleasant, warm light. She sat in the lotus position at a small table with an open book on it, and behind her stood a teapot on the nightstand with a burning candle, creating a peaceful atmosphere. The owner of the infirmary entered her room. Upon entering, he knelt down and bowed as a sign of greeting and respect for her. At this time, she looked at him with her amber eyes. He, in turn, lowered his blue eyes to the floor. There was a lamp on a brown wooden stand. It emitted a warm light. The patient was moved to a restroom. He was lying on a wooden bed wrapped in a white blanket. A carpet with intriguing patterns made up of shades of gray was spread across the floor. A young surgeon stood next to the bed. The guy standing by the bed was thinking about why the novel was written this way. The entire narrative revolved around the heroes, and the details that he knew about his wife, the heiress, were described only from her own perspective. He thought that a book couldn't lie. After all, if we assume that everything was planned from the very beginning, then it becomes a little clearer. It was planned that Cheon Yulan was a spy Haomun, whose goal was to become the lover of one of the princesses, who ended up being the main heiress, Funju Ha. The benefactor paused a little in his thoughts, turning over his thoughts. He suggested that such a scenario is quite likely because he knows what Haomun represents. Its members spread their influence through drinking establishments. Being part of Safa, they carry out many illegal orders, the highest paid of which are sales of information. The time when the main heiress was called Funju Ha dates back to the time of fierce struggle for the throne. And if Haomun wanted to order Cheong Yulan to infiltrate the imperial family as a brothel worker in order to obtain information, they would have done so. However, Cheong Yulan refused. The novel stated that Cheong Yulan was even willing to face death. But suddenly he was afraid of dying not from the hands of the angry Wang Ya, but from Hao Moon. While the young surgeon was sitting in his thoughts, his teacher came to his room. The student noticed him. He stood up and turned to him. "I want to ask a question." The teacher began to tell his student that all the stomach worms living in Kanho differ from each other in their functions and shape. However, there is something in common between them. All stomach worms at the larval stage grow by absorbing the internal energy of the body of their host. Due to the fact that worms are shaped by the same internal energy as their host, recognizing them by measuring their pulse is not an easy task. And even if it works, the analysis still will not show that the stomach worm is the parasite. The young guy thought that this was understandable because otherwise all the Magyo spies who were in Safa would be uprooted. Lin Yeagle leaned over a little, looking closely at the worm with his eyes. The chief doctor said that judging by the color and size of the worm, it had been in the body for quite a long time. Having examined it even more carefully, he suggested that it was possible even from early childhood. There was only one good thing. This worm did not have such a powerful destructive force and pain caused as the worms from Magyo. However, if a certain medicine is not taken within the prescribed period, the parasite causes anorexia in its carrier. The benefactor remembered that the novel said that Chung Yulan died of hunger. He then died of hunger for the reason that being in bitter sadness due to the inability to dance anymore, he could not eat anything. The guy realized that the puzzle piece had fallen into place. The boy's sharp attention was turned by a sound. This sound came from the patient. He woke up. The patient saw that he was in bed and that he was alive and assumed that the operation was successful. The young surgeon saw that the patient had woken up and headed towards him. He was glad that he had woken up. The student asked the guy not to move since he was just after surgery. The student also told the guy that they had discovered a parasitic worm, so they were forced to open the abdominal part. The guy was shocked by such news. He distorted his face because he did not expect that a worm would be found inside him. With his hand, he opened his chest to see what was going on there. He was very surprised that his abdominal part was opened. The young surgeon was worried and asked if everything was all right with the patient. It was very clear from the guy's face that he was, to put it mildly, not happy that he had been opened and possibly exposed. There was a tense pause between the two of them. The guy clenched his jaw with all his might and began to grimace in pain. The student realized that the guy was now trying to bite off his tongue to commit suicide. Seeing and understanding this, he attacked him to stop him and prevent him from committing suicide. The young surgeon hit the guy with all his might to stop him. Meanwhile, the patient pulled out his eyes in pain. He opened his mouth wide and stuck out his tongue, from which dark red blood splashed. The student was very angry with the patient's behavior. At that moment, the whole range of negative emotions was displayed on his face. He thought that all Murim residents were the same, as if they were carbon copies. Almost immediately, they commit suicide. The young surgeon covered the patient's mouth with his hand. He did not understand why the Murim people took their life as a joke and did not value it at all. He continued to cover the patient's mouth with his hand, which contained a thick piece of cloth. He tried to say something, but all he could do was bark. The young surgeon urgently asked the guy to calm down and come to his senses. He told him that he was on his side. The guy was very surprised by these words. The patient began to cough very badly from lack of oxygen. The young surgeon understood that if he had been brainwashed from childhood with spy tales instead of a regular education, then he would not trust a person so easily. The only good thing was that after the operation, the patient had no strength left, because otherwise there would have been more opportunities to go to his forefathers. The young surgeon was very angry that in order to save him, he hunched over for 10 hours, did not drink, did not eat, but only operated, and he just takes it and tries to kill himself. The temporary fixation bayonets were a work of art. The student continued to be very angry with the guy, shutting his mouth. The attempt to save this guy's life almost cost the young surgeon his own life. Therefore, dreaming of committing suicide was very rude to him. At this time, a beautiful white moon rose majestically outside the window. The sky around her was a bluish-violet hue, strewn with many bright stars, creating a unique picture of the majestic night elements. The room was enveloped in moonlight. There were broken dishes on the floor, onto which liquid was pouring from the kettle. The student continued to gag the patient's mouth, preventing blood from pouring out of his tongue. The young guy continued to accuse the patient of not even realizing how many doctors there are here. No matter how hard he tries to commit suicide, he will still be pulled out of the other world. The student asked the patient if he really read that if he dies, then Wang Ya will sit idly by. After all, suddenly she cannot stand the sadness and catches some kind of disease. While the young guy was accusing him, he calmly watched and listened to his words. The young surgeon removed his hands from the patient's mouth. The patient himself reached his hand to his mouth to pull out the tissue that was inside the mouth. The patient informed the benefactor that Wang Ya was not a weak person. The young surgeon agreed with him, but noted that, however, for the rest of her days, it would hurt her every time she remembered him. The sick man fell silent, thinking about the words he had just heard. The student was able to stop the bleeding from his tongue. He asked to be allowed to examine the wound. The benefactor urgently asked not to do anything like that again that could threaten life. The patient told the young surgeon that after many difficulties and suffering, he managed to secretly obtain a secret medicine that destroys the stomach worm. He thought that he had gotten rid of it, and that he was finally free. But in reality, this was not the case. The patient did not understand why this happened, and why it did not work. The student assumed that the guy's goal to kill the worm was the reason for leaving the Haman department, or it was not so. He probably had a hard time. It seems like the medicine didn't work completely. That same medicine did not destroy the worms, but only led him to a state of clinical death. But when the doctors gave the patient the sacred pill Becrin, the skull awakened because it has the ability to feed on the internal energy of the carrier. If he did this to get rid of the worm, perhaps the patient made it up that he fell off the horse. The young surgeon asked the patient if he had really fallen from a horse, saying that when examining his wound, it really looked like damage from a fall with a horse, period. But he did not understand something. He also noticed that the horse was probably well trained, and there was no reason for him to suddenly become enraged and rear up. The young surgeon did not receive a word in response. He assumed that since the patient is silent, it means it is connected with Hao Moon. Criminal organizations have their own life principles, period. If the information reaches Wang Ya's ears that Cheon Yulan was a spy, the entire Hao Moon will burn to the ground. To prevent this from happening, Hao Moon must silence Cheon Yulan by any means necessary. However, he survived with only a leg injury. The patient remembered that the student then told him that he was on his side. Therefore, the guy decided to ask whether the student believed him. The young surgeon answered in a calm tone that yes, he trusted him. Gathering his thoughts, the patient closed his eyes. The patient thought that since the student is a healer, he believes that he can share with him. The next day came and things were worse than ever. Since a worm was found in husband Wang Ya's stomach, it was impossible to hide the truth. The young surgeon, of course, convinced Cheon Yulan to tell the main heiress the whole truth and ask for forgiveness, but for some reason what was happening reminded him of an interrogation of addiction. Thank God the student managed to get permission to insert a word, so he tried to chat as best he could. And of course, I didn't forget to mention how painful it was for her husband all this time. In the room stood the owner of the infirmary with his colleague named Juho. Also in the room were warriors guarding the heiress. The heiress herself sat with a saddened face and closed eyes. She asked Lan Lan if the doctors were telling the truth. Hearing her question, the guy got up from his bed and sat down, at which time he frowned his eyebrows. The patient tried to gather his thoughts to answer his wife's question, while she looked at him with a look that was mixed with anger and sadness. The junior surgeon asked them not to quarrel. He believed that right now they needed to make peace. He said all this in the form of a joke, smiling in a good mood. Lan Lan answered his wife that the doctors were lying and their words were not true. The student opened his eyes wide and continued to smile. He was shocked that the patient lied to the heiress. The heiress began to get very angry from his words. She clenched her teeth tightly in anger. The patient's wife did not believe his words. She started screaming at him loudly, showing all her inner anger. Out of her anger, she threw the chair to the side with all her might. Wang Ya stood opposite the guy, looking at him. The student was very surprised by such a sharp reaction from the heiress. He did not understand why she was so wound up. Husband Wang Ya decided to tell her the whole truth. He revealed that he was Hao Moon's puppet and was their spy. But unfortunately you revealed, but he didn't regret anything. Hao Moon received quite a lot of information about Wang Ya from him. Wang Ya heard this and was filled with anger. She was very indignant that the guy took advantage of her trust in him. Juho and the owner of the infirmary stood and watched the conflict between the spouses. The young surgeon was filled with awkwardness inside. He clenched his teeth and widened his eyes from awkwardness. The student began to worry, so he decided to calm the heiress by telling her that the patient had lost his mind due to painful shock. The heiress waved her hand in his direction, asking him to shut up. Wang Ya told the benefactor that he was only allowed to speak once. The girl understood that he wanted to help, but despite this, she asked to be silent for a while. The benefactor realized that Wang Ya was very angry. The student looked at Lan and didn't understand what he was thinking when he said all this. Wang Ya angrily asked her husband if he had gotten close to her for profit. Lan answered her that she understood everything correctly. The heiress asked whether it was true that the guy ate a stomach worm against his will. The patient answered her that this fact was true. He did it for the sake of promotion to Haomun. He had no other choice. The heiress opened her eyes wide in shock. She could not believe just the words spoken by her husband. Wang Ya could not accept the fact that her husband was denying all the time and love that they shared together. Lan asked her for forgiveness, lowering your head down. The guy insisted that he was very uncomfortable inside because he dared to deceive her and her feelings. The girl tried her best not to show her emotions, although in fact she was filled with terrible pain inside. She tried to move all her emotions into her fist, thereby wanting him with all her might. Wang Ya asked Lan, "Didn't you love me for a second?" Her husband replied that she was right, and he did not like people like her. Lan also added that it was unbearable for him to receive care from a hated person. The guy's words greatly traumatized the girl. Tears flowed from her internal pain, and it was very difficult for her to restrain her emotions. Near them stood the owner of the infirmary, who silently observed the situation. The young surgeon was very indignant as he realized that this was all a clearly planned game. The wounded guy wanted to tear the heiress's heart into pieces with his words. Was he really serious about dying? There was a pause in the form of silence between the spouses. They just stood looking at each other. Lan said, lowering his gaze, that he considered himself a sinner. While at that time the girl was sleeping calmly in the family bed, the guy himself was all on alert. Medicine was very important to him. He often ran after him. He met with Haomun to obtain medicine. He began to talk about how he was engaged in espionage willy-nilly, but deception was not all there was to it. In it, when it was not possible to get medicine from Haomun, he had to suffer the whole night from pain and hunger, being literally on the verge of death. Writhing in pain, he thought through all the options. Having considered all the options, in the end he continued to transmit information in exchange for medicine that would allow him to last another 10 days. As soon as he received the medicine, his soul immediately became lighter from the thought that his physical suffering would now come. After eating the pill, the guy lost all physical suffering, and he could continue to function normally. Just hello, drug. He could at least eat something. While taking his medication, he liked to eat noodles with vegetables and meat. His wife was very fond of eating some strange vegetable or fruit that looked like cabbage. Being next to her, she smiled. In her head, everything was fine in their relationship. But unfortunately, at that time, she did not know that in fact her husband had very big problems. Lan himself was glad that she believed him, and thanks to her gullibility, he could earn money for his medicine, thereby extending his life. It's time to end this madness. Everything seemed fine in some relationships, but only one of them knew the whole truth. Betraying a loved one in order to drag out your existence is not love. It was necessary to finish all this as quickly as possible. In fact, being a spy is also very difficult because it all comes very much from one's conscience. The guy committed an unforgivable sin. While the girl was jumping for joy next to him, he was only playing the role of a loving husband. This guy dared to deceive her and her heart. Only after everything became clear did Lan manage to muster up the courage to confess everything. The guy begged the heiress to forget about him and meet a worthy man. The girl could not restrain herself from his words. She was filled with unbearable pain from the realization that her loved one had never loved her at all. She grabbed her chest, trying to hold in it all the pain that had just appeared. Salty tears flowed from the heiress's eyes like a river. The soldiers who guarded her were very angry at the patient's words, and the owner of the infirmary and Juho stood silently, but from their faces one could understand that they were also outraged by the patient's behavior. The junior surgeon was very indignant, since he worked very hard to save his life, and now because of his words he could lose his head and die. The student noticed something strange to the side. Something flashed to the side. It looked like it was a needle in the patient's hand. The patient said that he was very sorry to leave like this. He was sorry to leave like this, so he invited them to go on their final journey with him. The heiress's husband attacked her with a needle in his hand. At this time, the girl looked into his eyes. Her eyes reflected all the pain that was inside her due to the betrayal of her loved one. The young surgeon did not understand when that patient managed to pull out the pin supporting his leg. The patient tried to wound the heiress with his needle, but her wars protected her. The patient was very aggressive and tried his best to hurt his wife. Wang Ya just stood silently with tears in her eyes, watching his actions. The warrior became very angry at the patient's actions. A large amount of blood splashed. The student ran as fast as he could to try to stop it all. The student was very angry because of everything that was happening. From this anger, he crooked his face, clenching his teeth. Blood flowed very actively. The patient managed to puncture one warrior. The guy was glad that he managed to do it. He thought that this would be enough. This is how he will pay for all his sins, he believed. It's good that there is no pain. The heiress was sharply pierced with a sharp object and blood began to pour out of her mouth. I fell on Lan with my mouth open. The couple met their eyes, they were sobbing. The warrior accidentally pierced his mistress. Blood poured out of her. The warrior actually wanted to pierce her husband, but unfortunately it turned out differently. The warrior looked at the heiress. I felt very strong shame. The heiress lay on her husband's shoulder.